Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada Seminar Series. I'm really excited that today our speaker is going to be Mike Norton, who's going to be talking about the psychology of ritual. And we're also lucky enough to be joined by a set of four great panelists: Jane Risen, Kathleen Voss, Alice Moon, and Mickey Inslick. As well, both Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson will be here today. It should be a lot of fun. For those of you who don't know the format, there is a Q&A function where you can submit either questions or comments that can be seen by any of the panelists. And Mike might have a chance to get to some of them. He probably won't get to all of them, but it is the best way for you to send in those comments. All right, that's enough lead in. Mike, if you want to share your slides and get started, it's all yours.
Sure, thank you so much. Let's see. Hopefully that can be seen. Okay, great. So before I start that little thingy, I wanted to just quickly say, so we, many of you have heard of B.F. Skinner, who's like the father of something of behaviorism. And he has, I think it's apocryphal, but most good stories are apocryphal, so let's just stick with it. He did this research with pigeons a long time ago, and the way that it worked was there was a box that had like flashing lights and buttons and levers. And if the pigeons poked at the box with their beak, then food would come out. And so what the pigeons tried to do was, and this is from interviews with the pigeons, obviously, what we infer the pigeons were trying to do was figure out the patterns. So they would like peck it twice and then like pull the other thing once and then whatever, and then food would come out. And they would like hop around and things like that. So over time, each pigeon came up with their own way of getting the box to give them food, like jump twice and then peck twice and then jump again and peck over there. And of course the lights were completely random and the food was completely random as well that was coming out. But pigeons behaved as though their actions, and in particular their sequence of actions, would somehow matter in terms of getting food. So some people talk about that as evidence of ritual in other species, which we can talk about or not. But the reason I thought of that is because just before we started, the organizers of this talk series, who as you may know are very highly regarded scientists, told us that one time when they started this thing, everybody came in at the same time and something went wrong. And so they decided that from now on, the way that it would work is each person would have to come in separately at a preordained time when their name is announced in order to make sure that the talk went off okay, which is not exactly the same as pigeons tapping things. But anyway, all to say rituals are extremely ubiquitous, and sometimes we make them up without even knowing that we're making them up, I think is what's so interesting. So if we were in person right now, I would actually make everybody stand up and do this together. Literally, I just show this screen, and then people are like, I guess we have to do this, and they stand up and do this. And the reason that I start with, and we've used this exact ritual in some research, by the way, but the reason that I usually start with this is because a couple of things happen every single time. One is people stand up and do it, even though they don't have to. It's not like I can fire them or something. The next thing is almost immediately they start to sync up. So I just say, can everyone stand up and do that? I don't even say that. I say, go ahead. And people start to sync up their clapping. The other thing that always happens is that people start to speed up. So like once they start getting it right, then 3 claps are faster and then 5 claps are even faster. And by the end, so people will scream like, you know, whatever, let's go. By the end, people are really like jazzed about something as though something's going to happen, but then nothing happens and it's a huge letdown. The reason that I like to do that is because a couple of reasons. One is rituals really do affect how we think and feel. Sometimes I think rituals are seen as like magical or only religious or something like that, but they're all over the place. We'll talk about a lot of domains. They're all over the place, and they do affect how we think and feel, even despite ourselves. Like if you've ever been to a religious service that it's not your religion or you don't feel very religious, you can sometimes become enmeshed in that feeling or in that moment despite your beliefs. So they do stuff to us, I guess, is the non-scientific way to do it. But the other reason that I like to do this is because, number one, people sort of feel a bit bonded when they do this, but also what happens almost immediately is if someone does it wrong, everybody gets really mad at them. Like you can see, I don't have like video footage of it, but you can see almost like disgust reactions if someone claps a fourth time, like everyone's doing it right. And then you hear one person clap a fourth time and people's heads whip around. And if you ask them what happened, they're like, well, he was doing it wrong, which is crazy because I just told them I made this up and they've never done it before in their lives. But immediately there's a right way to do it that we do. And if you do it incorrectly, there's a wrong way. And people who do it wrong feel embarrassed and feel really bad about themselves. So this has both the positive aspects of rituals that I'll talk a lot about, that they do good things to us, but then it also has within it this negative aspect that they can take over in ways that we might not like. So that's sort of the goal for the talk, is really to share a bunch of different projects with some of the people who are panelists have been co-authors on some of these, and they'll probably tell me that I'm describing it wrong. But I won't show a lot of data, but I'll show a lot of domains, because for me, what's interesting is just how ubiquitous rituals are in all domains of life. And at this point, you are probably thinking, well, what is a ritual? Because usually somebody raises their hand, usually someone in the front row raises their hand and says, but what is a ritual? And the answer is it's this very slippery construct. So I'll have some bad answers for it, but maybe the panelists also have ideas as well. But one way to think about it is like this. So look at these two ways that you could spend your morning. You could, when you get up in the morning, you could brush your teeth and then take a shower, or you could take a shower and then brush your teeth. You can do other things as well, but science has shown that most people do one of these two things. Like 90% of people do one of these two things. Some people do both at the same time, which I think is super gross, but that's up to you. So you have these two ways of doing the morning. Almost always, half of people say A and half of people say B. So there's not a consensus way to spend your morning. You either do brush teeth and then take a shower, or you do take a shower and then brush your teeth. So keep in mind which person you are right now, and then mentally simulate if I made you do it in the other order tomorrow morning. Like if I said tomorrow, if you're a brush then shower person, what I want you to do is shower and then brush. And try to like simulate how you might feel. And what also we found over time is that half of people couldn't care less. And you may be one of them. You might be like, what difference does it make? In the morning, I need to shower, I need to brush my teeth. Doesn't really matter what order I do it in. You could see that as you're sort of like, you have a morning habit a little bit. So in the morning, you have tasks that you need to get done, and you do them before you do something else, because that's the things you need to get done. If you felt at all, even a little tinge of weirdness around changing the order, just a little like unsettled feeling, or sometimes you'll even like cringe a little bit, people will say, I wouldn't feel right after, like my day would start off wrong if I did it in the other order. That means that it's a little closer to being a ritual for you. I don't mean like ritual all the way out, whatever the endpoint is. I just mean as soon as you start caring about the order of things and the timing of things, and as soon as those attributes have more meaning to you, meaning if there's something in them that matters to you, even though it shouldn't necessarily matter, and changes might upset you, you're getting a little closer to having a morning ritual instead of like a morning routine or habit. And the reason that I use that example as well is because it shows how hard it is to define rituals and habits. Because if I went and observed all of your morning routines, other than being super creepy, one of you might brush your teeth and take a shower, and it would be a pure habit for you. Like you couldn't care less which order you do it in. Another one might do the exact same order, but for you, it's really important. But I can't tell which you are by looking at you. So I can't say, oh, it's specifically the way that she's brushing her teeth that means that that's a ritual instead of a habit, because some of the definition is totally internal to ourselves. There's things that matter like repetition and timing and order, but a lot of it actually is what you bring to it. And that's what we got really interested in, actually, is not so much the like formal religious rituals, communal rituals that we've read about and studied, but the weird ones that people come up with themselves that they devise to deal with some or another problem that they're having. that often nobody else knows about, and they just do it for themselves. That's the kind that I find really, really interesting, and I'll talk about a bunch of domains. Do panelists have any strong objections or kudos?
I wonder if I could ask a question, Mike.
Yeah.
First, I am not Michael Norton. I've already gotten some private DMs that saying that you've caught my style, Mike.
No, whoa. Other way around.
It's possible. I think if we were both standing up, it'd be clear those differences in style. But I see a question from an audience member, which is a question that I had myself, which relates to your starting anecdote, where you described the organizers kind of having this superstition, really,
yep.
About starting the videos on at the same time. And B.F. Skinner, his work was actually not, at least he never called it about rituals. He talked to them as superstitions.
Yeah.
So so what is the difference? Are they different? How do you see the relationship?
Yeah, in fact, so sometimes people will think, this isn't quite what you asked, but I will answer that. But people will, like, even with brushing your teeth and showering, you will think, mine's not like a superstition or a ritual. Mine's the right way to do it. Like, starting it in sequence is definitely the right way to do it. So it's not a ritual or it's not a superstition. And I would agree with that if you had, for example, like for a year of your life, alternated days brushing and showering versus showering then brushing, and like kept a tally of which one was better and then went with it. Or if the organizers had done an experiment where they did A/B testing on whether joining together is better or worse. But we almost never do that. And in fact, for most things that we have, like what day in your life did you decide to brush your teeth first and then take a shower? There's no, you're not like, I'll never forget that day. It was cloudy. It's just something that you're doing. So they're often this kind of, thoughtless is too strong a word, but they're in us and they feel right, but we often are lacking evidence. To the actual question, though, to me, superstitions are a subcategory of ritual. So superstitions are generally to ward off something bad or to cause something good to happen. But lots of rituals don't take that element. So superstitions take the form of, like, I'm not going to walk under a ladder, I'll go around, for example. They take the form of ritualistic behavior. There's not a clear causal actual link to that behavior and not having bad luck or something, but we feel good about it. But lots of rituals aren't really related to those specific goals in life. For example, funerals, which I'll talk about next, they're not really about exactly warding off something bad happening to me or causing something good to happen to me. They're like another thing that I'm trying to get done. Or weddings is an example. They don't feel as much like superstitions as they do a ritual that we're doing for another reason. So for me, superstitions are a kind of ritual, like a subcategory of rituals, but a super cool one. And some of us even on the panel have studied superstition because they're so fascinating in terms of what they do to us and how important they are to us. So in fact, would that person like to chat at all? Jane, would you like to chime in?
Well, I can chat. I guess I would say that instead of thinking of superstition as a component of rituals, I would almost think of them as kind of like a Venn diagram, and that there's the overlap where they are, because I also think that superstitious behavior, which is the kind of rituals that you're talking about, are only going to be a component of superstitions if we think about the beliefs that people have, and they're not always acted out in specific kinds of behavior. So I think of sort of the overlap in our Venn diagram of where we're going to see the kinds of behaviors that are trying to create something good or avoid something bad, as you said. That's where they're going to overlap. But I think you're going to have elements of superstition that don't fit there, and you're going to have elements of ritual that don't fit there either. So I don't know that I don't think I would put superstition entirely inside ritual, because I think that there are such superstitious elements that are also outside of what I would describe as ritual. But I don't think that they're entirely overlapping. I agree with you.
That's super interesting. And so one thing that I think is very ill-defined for rituals is, do they have to have physical components or not? The ones we think of typically have that in them, like there's clapping or something, but it's not clear in our research either whether those are, like, if you think of the continuum, of real rituals are way out there, are physical actions like an attribute that make it more ritually, or are they a necessary attribute? And without them, it's not really a ritual. It's hard because sometimes it feels like, yes, the actions are required, but in other cases it can feel like, no, they're not required. But I like the idea that lacking actions gets it closer to like a mental superstition where I'm just warding off good luck by thinking something weird, you know, in my head. And if I watched you, I would have no idea you were doing a ritual, because you'd just be staring into space.
I also think I think that this was kind of casual. You dropped in the idea, you said people end up just creating rituals whenever they have a problem to solve. And I think that that's one kind of function for ritual. And when that's the kind that ends up overlapping quite a bit more with superstition. But when I think that that's not, I guess I can ask that as a question do you think that rituals always are designed to solve problems? I think that's in cases where it might not, that's where we might open up and you might help people in the audience think about rituals that might not feel quite as overlapping, like your example of a wedding. I mean, I guess you can think of a wedding as solving a kind of problem, but that might not be the purpose of that wedding ritual.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And in fact, Kathleen and Juliana and I have a paper where we sort of take a view of rituals as, in general, an emotion regulation strategy with many ways that can happen. But one is bad and trying to get you back to okay, like a superstition or maybe even a funeral might be that. But there's a huge class of rituals which are, you're fine, but let's make it even better. And those are things like weddings or consumption rituals, for example. Like the wine's going to be good whether you do the ritual or not, but let's do a ritual and see if we can bump it up as well.
Sorry, I'm going to give one last thing. I'm noticing there's a bunch of good questions in the chat, but one thing I thought it might be worth expanding is the difference between group rituals versus individual rituals. I don't know if you have that coming in your slides, but that's coming up in some of the questions about whether rituals are specifically for coordination and things like that. And I don't know if you wanted to just say a little bit about that.
So we've done, including us, have done some work on group rituals. I'm not going to focus on them today, not because they're not cool, I think they are, but because I'm really interested in the kind that people come up with just for themselves. So they're lacking. So one attribute of ritual is often communal, and even religious often has built into it a communal aspect. I'm really interested in the kind that actually aren't communal. They're not inherited, really. They're ones that people come up with themselves. So the other kind are totally cool, and we have studied them, but I'll focus today more on the kind that are people coming up with them. And let me actually go to the first example of what I mean, because it's a good example of, you can study this domain in the communal sense, or you can study it in the individual sense. And the domain is mourning. So by the way, I'm pretty sure all of these studies are with Francesca Gino and then other co-authors, and I tried to put their names at the bottom of the slides, but if I forgot, I apologize. The idea for the mourning paper came from this book by Drew Gilpin-Faust, who was the president of Harvard at the time. And so if I showed this slide, it sounded like I was trying to like kiss up to the president of Harvard, but actually it's a really good book. One of the things that she wrote about was grieving rituals in the American Civil War, in the South in particular, where like every woman lost several male relatives who were close to her. So what does a culture do when they're confronted with that kind of loss? And she looked at and we know, because we've seen it all over the world, but people do things, for example, with clothing. So I'm going to get the details wrong, but you would wear black for a little while, and then you would wear gray for a little while. Then you could add lavender, like a lavender ribbon for a little while. And then you could go back to dressing the way that you did before. And what was so interesting to me, especially as a social psychologist, is the amount of time that you had to do each of those phases depended on how close you were to the person. So again, I don't have the details right, but like if it was your husband, it would be a year in black and a year in gray. But if it was your cousin, it was 3 months and 3 months. So that was really so interesting to think about. Number one, there's the communal aspect of that, which is so important, which is people around me know how I'm doing because they can see what I'm wearing. So they know where I am in my stage of grief. We've lost that now. So we don't know when people are grieving or not typically, because we don't do those rituals anymore. The plus side is we can be private about our loss. The downside is people can't help us. with our loss. But the other thing that was like so interesting was just this idea that I could, and again, this is such a social psychological thing, I apologize, but I could look down at myself and think, I've lost someone, I'm feeling grief. And I could look down and see that I'm wearing gray, and that would send some signal to me, like I'm getting there, that this grief will end, because if this culture has this elaborate color thing, it must mean that other people have used this to get through grief. So maybe it can do something for me as well. So we got an RA to look all over the world at clothing rituals and color rituals in general. And what's so cool is that they're pretty much every grieving ritual you can find has something to do with clothing and color, but it's all over the place which color. So many cultures have black, many other cultures have white, some cultures use red, some cultures use green. You can make up a story for why any of those colors make sense for what they are symbolizing. What's interesting, of course, is if you wore the wrong color, it would be a huge offense to the family of the bereaved. But also just this idea that, and I don't mean to be cavalier about rituals because they are deeply meaningful to us, but this idea that at some point people in a culture were grieving and they decided to use clothing as one way to cope with that, and they decided to use color as one way to cope with that. But that was a decision that someone made at some point, and then those can last for thousands of years, and neighboring countries even can have chosen a different color. And to me, that doesn't mean that they're trivial. They're still deeply important to the people in those cultures. But from like a macro sense, it's just interesting that people search around for something that they can use when they're grieving to help with their grief. Another huge one, and for people who think Mickey is me, this one will be very relevant as well. People use hair in nearly every culture. So in some cultures, you shave hair off. In some cultures, you grow hair. Sometimes you keep the hair of the deceased person with you as a way to honor them. Again, feeling grief, wanting to do something, we can use clothing and we can use hair and we can use other things, of course, as well. But that to me is totally, totally fascinating because it suggests that people are a little bit flexible in what they use. And some of them become adopted by wider groups, but probably some of them don't, and we don't have evidence of them anymore. And so the very first survey we did actually on grief was we just asked people, have you lost someone? We did both actually someone who passed away and a relationship that ended. And we just said, what did you do? Not what ritual did you do, just what did you do? And we thought at the time that people were going to write about funerals, actually. So we thought we were going to study these kinds of rituals. And instead what we found was like huge evidence that people were freelancing with their grief. That people would say things like, well, there was a funeral or there was a wake, but then what I did was this, and then they would tell us something that they did. I want to skip that and go to this. So for example, this woman who'd lost her mother said, I used to play the song by Natalie Cole, I Miss You Like Crazy, and cry every time I heard it and thought of my mom. This other older woman wrote, just this, I washed his car every week as he used to do. So like first off, those are very sad and I apologize. From a scientific standpoint, those are not in some ancient book of wisdom that tells us, how to grow. Natalie Cole is not that old, and cars were not around hundreds of years ago, it turns out. So again, it's as though people are looking around the environment for things that they can incorporate into their grief that will help them. The car example was her husband had an antique car that he loved, that he used to wash every week and never drive. And when he passed away, she kept the car and washed it every week as well. From one standpoint, that's like a waste of time because you're not using the car and you should get rid of it. From any sort of human standpoint, you can see how meaningful that might be for somebody to do that. And we just saw like example after example of people telling us these private things that they were doing. And if you think of it, I don't mean to be too depressing, but if you think of your own losses, very often you come up with something that's very specific to that person, and you would never use it for the next person because it's so specific to that person. And that was what was so interesting, was this idea that like under the surface a little bit, people are devising these rituals that might be helping. Then of course we had to say, do they help or not? So that's the research part. But for me, the observation was actually really interesting. These are maybe a little bit funnier. So this is,
Mike,
yeah.
sorry, can I ask a quick question? So
yeah, of course.
why are people doing these things, like I can think of at least two reasons. Like one is to try to help themselves get over it and grapple with it. I think that's partly what you're implying. But another thing, at least in this domain, could be kind of feeling a sense of obligation to honor the person that is gone. And so it's not, you're not doing it so that you can actually get over it. You're doing it more because you feel like it's the thing that you should be doing. You're honoring them in some way, or you're keeping them in mind. You're making sure that you're thinking about them. So do you have evidence of why people do these kinds of things?
Yes, and there's a third one that's actually we have some evidence as well, which is even a more general mechanism, which is that when you lose someone, you feel loss of control, general sense of control over your life. Lots of research on grief and grieving has shown that losing someone makes you feel in less control of your outcomes. Of course, because you didn't want to lose that person and there's nothing you could do about it. We can show that one of the things that rituals do is they restore a little bit that sense of control, a little bit, and then that restored sense of control a little bit helps with your grief. Obviously, doing like a ritual does not solve your grief. You have to have social support and all sorts of things, but at least one of the aspects actually is that control part as well. People will say very similar things, which are, I did this ritual to honor him. So sometimes people are actually trying to move on and forget, and sometimes people are trying to remember and keep, but they'll often do the exact same kind of ritual to do those two things. So the problem that, as they've defined it, is, for example, I need to move on, or you can define the problem as I need to remember. And in any case, it seems like people turn to rituals sometimes to solve both of those goals. So again, it's like this domain general sort of thing where, however you're defining the problem, one of the tools you bring to bear are rituals. I don't know if that was a good answer or not.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Mike, I wonder if I could follow up a little bit. All these examples you bring up, and this reflects my own thinking about my own work and some of your past work. To what extent is effort required or pain in these rituals? So I know you mentioned that some of the rituals could be, you might not be able to observe them, but that person is doing something with their minds. And I imagine it's not just, I'm just daydreaming about the person. There's something like that requires some effort. So is that a key component, or am I just kind of, I've got a hammer and all I see are nails?
I think, so I haven't looked specifically, and I'm going to butcher his name and I apologize if someone knows how to say it. Dimitri Xygaladis. Is that even close? Anyway, amazing research on rituals. He's looked specifically, I think with some people on the call, specifically at the role of effort. And it does seem as though effort can enhance the impact of rituals. A lot of the rituals we study are pretty low effort. So you're definitely doing something. So to Jane's point from earlier, there's an action almost always involved, but they're typically not like inconveniencing people exactly, if that makes sense. But we haven't, as you asked that question, I don't think in the grieving research, we ever coded for effort, actually, which is just, I mean, literally how long does it take would be just interesting to see if that helps or not. Some of them are one-time things, and some of them are repeated things as well. So sometimes people, when someone passes away, they'll do a thing and then they're done. And other people, like the washing the car, they'll do a periodic thing that they keep coming back to. There, we didn't see much evidence that one was better than the other, actually. So, which we thought there might be like a huge effect. But again, it's self-selection. So maybe if the loss is smaller, you can do a one-time thing. And if it's bigger, you can do a bigger one. Like these, like the breaking up ones are almost always single shot. So this was, we said, think of a relationship that ended and people wrote about what they did. These are rarely actually like over time. These are almost always put it behind me. So this person wrote, I wrote a letter expressing my feelings and I never mailed it. I destroyed the letter and let my painful feelings go. The word destroyed, both of these have the word destroyed because it's a good word, but it actually comes up a fair amount with rituals. Like destroy or burn is a very common thing that people will do when a relationship ends. but this is my favorite one. This person said, I looked for all the pictures we took together during the time we dated. I then destroyed them into small pieces. Then this is the best, even the ones I really liked, and then burnt them in the park where we first kissed. So this is, first off, you're judging this person, and then you're realizing you probably did something like that at some point yourself. Maybe not in a park, but a private burning or something. These are, like, the second one is more ritualistic than the first one, and it took more effort. You could say, because you had to go to the park and light a fire. The first one you wrote and then tore it up. We don't see, like, a huge effect of the more elaborate really matters, or even the number of features often doesn't matter a ton. So we can code it for ritualness, I guess. And it matters, but it doesn't account for a huge amount of variance typically. It seems like this is a total overgeneralization, but it seems more like yes, no, than a continuous kind of, you know, if the fire were for 4 hours, you'd feel 4 times better than if the fire were, you know, for 1 hour. It doesn't seem to be so much that. It seems to be, have you done some of it or have you not done some of it? But that's almost certainly domain specific. So I don't mean that to generalize across other domains.
Oh, sorry. And then Mike, I was just thinking maybe too, it's more of a function of how much emotion regulation the person might need. Like the second person here, maybe feeling that more, you know, just more anger, you know, just more distress compared to the first person. So you're right, it is sort of a 0-1 binary, but in another sense, it could be in that compensatory notion.
Yeah. I love that idea. Actually, we've never looked to see, even though I use this, this phrase, like solve a problem sort of thing, I don't think we've ever looked to see how many emotions people are trying to change.
Yeah.
So like if someone broke up with you, you could just feel sad, or you could feel sad and angry, and guilty or something else. And I wonder, yeah, confused. And yeah. I wonder if people will use more rituals to solve each of the emotions that they're trying to change, or if it just gets lumped into I'll do something to solve all of those. I don't think we've ever looked at it in that way. Yeah. Okay, let me move on to some other domains, just to, I don't know, move on. So this is our newest project, actually, on rituals, because it's COVID related. This is with my student, Jimena Garcia-Rada, who's on the job market, and also my other student, Jim and Nam. So there's this thing with rituals where when you look at the qualitative literature, typically the story is that rituals start in times of change or times of chaos, or when things get chaotic, that's when people bring rituals online. But it's typically sort of historically looking. So you can say this ritual started at a time when that country was at war, and that's when this ritual came out of it. But obviously there's not a ton of research on when a huge change happens, do people turn to rituals in that moment or not? There's a super cool paper by an economist whose name I now forget, who's at Harvard, which is even more embarrassing. But they looked at the time that rituals have persisted in different cultures as a function of climate variability. And once you hear the result, it's like an obvious one, but it's so amazing that they had this idea, which is, if you're in a climate where the weather does not change over time over the last 1,000 years, the ritual you were doing 1,000 years ago is still the one you're doing today, because it's still solving the problem. So if you were in a drought region then, and you're still in a drought region, you're still doing the same make it rain ritual that you were doing. But if you live in a region where it's gone like drought and then freezing and then drought and then freezing, for example, then your rituals have changed over time. And the current one is more recent, because it was like designed to solve the current problem. So it's a super cool way to think about when we change them and when we don't. And in that sense, it's literally like, why are we doing a ritual to make it rain while it's raining? Maybe we should do something else. And then the whole culture shifts to something else, which I think is super interesting.
So,
by the way, there's this.
San Diego has no rituals because their weather is always perfect and it never changes. Is that
Yeah.
the idea?
And in the Northeast, maybe we're just waiting for snow. Yeah, there's this really cool anthropological paper that looks at rituals that seem to be a waste of time. And one of them is, of course, many cultures have devised some sort of ritual to make it rain. like over history, it's a crazy the number of cultures that have done this. And of course, when there's a drought, it's an incredibly important problem and you really need it to rain. So it's not that surprising. To me, it's surprising that they turned a ritual instead of something else. But what's so interesting is that I'm quite sure, I'm not that kind of scientist, but I'm quite sure that they don't work in the sense that things we do like today on the ground don't cause rain to happen or not. But what the anthropologists point to is that it's true that they don't work, but in times of drought, there's a lot of social strife. So it's kind of like the social contract starts to break down. We stop helping each other. We start hoarding all sorts of things because we're so worried about the climate. And what the rituals to make it rain do actually is they bring us back together with some sort of shared event and shared history as well. So the one view is like, there's a drought, stop dancing around and do something about it. And the other view is that ritual that you're doing actually is much more important than anything else you can do. And that this is something we can control, how we're dealing with each other. We can't control that. So it's just an interesting case where the thing that we're doing, we kind of think it's for reason X, but in fact it can be for a different reason. Anyway, that was a super long preamble to an extremely simple study that we did, correlational study, to be clear. We asked parents, so if you are a parent, you can think for, as I am, you can think for yourself if you've started any new rituals since the pandemic started. Actually, for anybody, have your rituals changed as a result of the pandemic? But we just asked parents. We did a couple of pilot surveys, and then this one is pre-registered, where we asked people, basically we asked parents, how are you doing? How are you feeling about your parenting? We asked them if they'd come up with any new parenting rituals during the pandemic. We also asked them if they had rituals before, so we can control for that, obviously. But then we also asked them the extent to which they were teaching their kids about the seed animal. Then this person comes in, and then there's this song. Like we do them all the time. Oh no, the recording stopped. Did I say something controversial that you wanted to? I like that. He doesn't know anything about parenting.
It was just those 3 seconds that, yeah.
You thought I was about to say something horrifying? Yeah. Children are evil. Would have been a good statement to take out. So, yeah, and I want to say, by the way, this is all self-report. So we don't have, are the parents actually teaching the behaviors? We don't have, are the kids actually wearing the mask? So just to be super clear about the limitations of what's happening here, this is parents telling us what they're doing and how they're feeling about these behaviors. But when we ask parents, do you have any new rituals? From survey to survey, typically like 60 to 75% say yes, actually. If you ask, did you have any rituals before, that sometimes varies like from 70 to 90%. So most parents will say in old world, yeah, I had a ritual actually for the morning or for getting the shoes on or for toothbrushing or whatever it might have been. But this set of people, 60 to 70% said we also have them new ones now. I'll just show you a couple. Some of them are related to what's happening. So this person wrote, my kids are really into the zombie apocalypse and love that genre. To keep the mask wearing and social distance in their mind, we act as if they are keeping away from the zombie virus. So you can imagine what they're doing with their kids. This one's not COVID related, but because we have more time, many parents have more time with kids. They said I started as a 10-minute silly moment to take 10 minutes of our day to be silly and laugh to get out all of the wiggles. We don't know if this is because things are so stressful that you say, let's create 10 minutes of non-stress or not. But a lot of them have this element of, in some way, they're responding to the changes in the world. A lot are about like doing homework and very practical things as well. Like what's the new ritual to get our kid to do homework when I'm still in the house or when there's a new caregiver than there used to be and things like that. So that's just a couple of the examples. These are the results. So for the darker bars are they said I have a new ritual and lighter bars are I didn't. What we see is that parenting satisfaction, this is how satisfied are you with your parenting compared to before. So parents who say they have a new ritual are report being more satisfied, and they report teaching about these behaviors more. Again, this is their reports of what they're doing. So there's some evidence that if you have a new ritual, you feel a little better about your parenting, and you're teaching some of these behaviors that are related to the new rituals that you brought on board. We can do things, again, hugely self-selected. We can do things like, as I said, control for, did you have parenting rituals before? And those things matter in the way you'd think, but they don't seem to account for all of it. So when we try to control for as many pre-parenting aspects as we can, we still tend to see that there's some effect of parenting satisfaction. I mean, of rituals on parenting satisfaction. Obviously, we can't control for all pre-existing differences. So, as I said, huge grain of salt on these. Then this is this box, which I just wanted to show, even though I'm not a fan of these things in general, but just to show a couple of things. One is that the link between the ritual and teaching the behaviors is pretty high. So that, to me, that's a little bit interesting that we're using the rituals for these behaviors. The other one is obviously having a novel pandemic ritual is not going to be like 90% of your parenting satisfaction, and it's not. Nor are teaching these behaviors like sucking up all of the variance. Of course they're not. But there's a little bit of evidence that it is because your kids maybe are doing more of these behaviors now, maybe that's a little bit why you feel better about your parenting. And again, I don't have the causal data for that at all, but I think it's I thought it was worth sharing anyway, because it's the newest thing that we've done. And I thought, to me, it's interesting, just period, that parents use rituals with kids, as we all do. I'm going to see if there's questions. I'm sure there's questions on that, including, I don't believe you.
Mike, can I ask, so you mentioned earlier that it matters how you think of it. So you can look at the same set of behaviors and it can be a ritual for one person and not for the other. And so when you start to investigate something like this, like parents' rituals for their kids, does it matter whether the kids think of it as a ritual or if the kids think of it as a routine? And, you know, I know you're measuring the parent satisfaction. And so I'm just kind of curious about how you're thinking about this. And I know in other of your research, you've done some of this sort of who's thinking about the behavior in what way. And so I thought maybe you could share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting question to think about, is the shared, like if kids believe it as well, is it going to work even better? Here we don't have the kids. My hunch is that the answer would be possibly, but for very little kids, the rituals that they do are, it's just the world. Like, in other words, they have no comparison set for bedtime. So the way that they do bedtime is bedtime. You know what I mean? Because it's like, well, of course you have a gray bunny. I mean, doesn't everybody have a gray bunny kind of thing? And then you find out your friend has like a red bunny and you're like, what the hell? You know, blows your mind. So I'm not sure for little kids if it would matter, but for older kids, it may. In other research on couples, rituals, romantic couples, basically, we can show, that's also research with Jimena Garcia-Rada, we can show that people who agree that they have a ritual have higher relationship satisfaction than people who disagree. It's actually super depressed. So we ask couples, basically, do you guys have a couples ritual that you do? The cutest one that I always think of is one couple said, every time before we eat or drink, we clink our forks, just like one time, a little clink, and then they go do their thing. There, correlationally, couples that have rituals are happier. Again, self-selection and everything. But we do find that if one person says they have, like, we have a couples ritual and the other person says no, that's not very good for the couple. So one person's like, oh, we do this super cute thing where every time before we eat something, and the other person just checks like no, because they don't really see it as like a meaningful thing that they're doing. They're like, yeah, I don't know why we have to do that thing. It's kind of stupid. So there's something about agreement there. Now the effect isn't huge. So it's not like if we disagree, we're miserable. It's just a little bit of an effect of disagreement, but it would be super interesting in this context as well to see if, number one, do kids' attitudes matter at all? And then number two, does the overlap between them matter? It's super hard to do, as many of you know, super hard to do research on kids. And especially around some of these sorts of, this was a hard study to run because of we're actually assessing these sorts of behaviors. So it's health behavior. And then it gets a little bit harder even to get kids, which is just an excuse to say we did not collect data from kids, even though it would have been super cool. Other questions? I think I heard another.
So building off of that, do you know all of this stuff is like self-selected? Can you get, if it's the case that it has to be self-generated, can you have experimental evidence on this, like where you force someone to have a ritual? And also, if so, is it something like kind of with your first example with clapping, then stomping or something like that? If you do that in the same order each time, would that differ from like clapping, then stomping, and then stomping, then clapping next time? Do you have any evidence on that?
Yes, and if I'm lucky, the next thing I was going to talk about is that. It sort of is. So two questions is, one is making it up yourself versus I give it to you. And the other, of course, which is super important, is causal evidence that rituals, and you could think of that as like a 2x2, like make it up yourself or not, make you do it or not kind of thing. In this next project, I'll have a little bit, next two projects, a little bit on those two aspects. We do experiments with rituals. Some domains, it's a lot easier to do the experiments than others. So it's very hard, for example, to get couples to start a new couples ritual. We've tried. It's very hard to get them to start a new couples ritual and to measure it over time and see if it has an effect. But other domains like consumption, it's a lot easier to do rituals because we're just going to have you eat or drink a thing, and then we can have you do different stuff and see, does it impact you or not. This is just this is probably a slide from when I'm talking to MBA students and I'm trying to convince them that rituals have something to do with business, to be honest. So marketers all over the world are fascinated by rituals. But anyway, the Stella one is kind of cool because they literally use these like deeply religious words and stuff like that. So marketers do actually think rituals resonate with people. They're all over the place, actually. But okay, so super simple study that I'll just share with you. This was a project with Yajin Wang and also Kathleen. So simple. Million confounds, obviously, in this 2-cell experiment. One is we just give people chocolate and say, eat it. And people do. And we say, do you like it? And other people, we give them a ritual to eat. So we say, break it in half, unwrap half, eat that half, unwrap the other half, eat that half. And then we ask them how much they like it. If you think about eat the free chocolate, obviously you have to unwrap it and like break it maybe and eat it. So it's not like we're telling you to like, spin it around on your finger for 30 minutes or something. It's pretty subtle. And yet we find that people enjoy the chocolate a bit more. Here, Mickey, to your point about effort, totally could just be effort going into this, which is just you made me do more stuff and so I'm enjoying it more. But the next study will get a little bit at the effort thing and also a little bit cleaner experiment on how this works. So in the next study, we wanted to get people to eat carrots just because. And the way that this one works is it's a repeated ritual. So we have people, there's 3 bags of carrots in front of you and you make a fist and you knock twice. You take the bag, you put it in front of you, you knock twice, you take a deep breath, close your eyes, and then you eat the carrot. And then we have you do that again and eat the carrot. And then in the research with Yajin and Kathleen, we, on the next one, we stop you, like you do the ritual again, and then you're gonna eat a carrot, and we say, stop, how excited are you about the next carrot? And people are a little bit more excited about the next carrot as they've been going through this. And in this paper, led by Alan and Juliana, we try to see if it can get people to choose carrots over chocolate. So can we have rituals help you with self-control? And we find a little bit. So definitely people still prefer chocolate. It's not like a preference reversal or something, but a little bit, if you've been doing rituals with carrots, a little bit, you're more likely to choose the carrot to eat. In a different condition in these experiments, we do things like we give you a different ritual each time. So one time you do the knocking thing, but on round 2, you do something different. And on round 3, you do something different. And there we're trying to control for the effort. So it's the same amount of effort that you're putting in, but there we're trying to specifically vary ritual, like more cleanly, experimentally. And we find that that matters actually. So doing stuff can matter, like to your point, Mickey, effort definitely does stuff to us. Here it seems there's an extra effect of the ritual on how we're thinking and feeling. And then to the question of people making it up themselves or not. So here where making people do these. Sometimes we draw on things that people actually do. You know, like we'll look in the qualitative data and then use things for the lab experiments. Sometimes, honestly, we just make them up. We've tried in a few different projects to compare them. So we let some people make it up and some people we give it to them. And we don't see clean evidence either way. Typically, they don't differ. And if they have differed, it's not systematic. And I wouldn't put any trust like, yes, it's definitely if you come up with it yourself. It feels like making it up yourself should matter more because you'd incorporate more elements of you into the ritual. So my feeling, despite the data, is that there's an experiment to be done where that would matter, but we haven't had much success differentiating those two from each other.
Wait, can I
questions on food? Yeah.
Can I ask something? So just kind of to that point, it occurred to me as you were having that discussion that, you know, even when we gave them, I'm only thinking of the food rituals here, we gave them rituals so they were like other imposed, but it's a very natural context. Food rituals go back centuries. And so it may not have felt, you know, like some experimenter imposed rituals in a context that wouldn't maybe necessarily be associated with them may have different effects compared to self-generated ones, you know, like, so you can think of contexts that are really idiosyncratic in terms of whether a person has a ritual, and others in which it's fairly standard. And food and drink rituals are, you know, as I just mentioned, like going back centuries. So that might account for some of the differences or non-differences that you were just discussing.
Yeah, I like that idea. Even we could make you do, I think I'm going to talk about performance pretty soon, but we could make you do tasks that are familiar or unfamiliar. So like you're used to doing stuff before you throw a ball,
yeah,
but you're not used to doing stuff before like firing a crossbow or something. So maybe we could, you know, if we switch the domain a little bit, maybe we could break the link or something. We might see a difference.
And there are also probably elements of rituals, like when you went through each of these domains that you're going through, there's some kind of components that you see lots of people have something shared when they come up with something for grief and mourning versus consumption and performance. And so, you know, before the big game, you're not going to have people do a very quiet meditative ritual. And if you assign them that, it may not be as effective as if you let them choose. But if we assign them something that fits the domain that they're trying to that they're trying to be better in, or whatever their function, their goal is for that particular ritual, if we assign it in a matched kind of a way, you're going to be less likely to find a difference than if we deliberately assign a very poorly matched ritual.
That just made me think of Phil Jackson, the basketball coach. So he was, I think it's the Zen Master or the Zen something was his nickname, because he like read a book about Buddhism or something at some point, and then he was supposed to be like a guru. But he actually, he's actually a great coach, but leave that aside. He like subverted the thing. He was like, no, team sports are not about getting jazzed. Team sports are actually about bringing it down and being meditative. And I wonder if that's partly why people were like, wow. You know, like if you do the opposite thing, maybe people are like, whoa, he's amazing. Like, what an idea she had. And maybe she's like a guru now. But if you do the same thing, people are like, yeah, we already know about the clapping. I wonder if there's something to be done there. But yeah, totally. I think in general, the fit with your expectations would be cool. Have I ever vaguely done this or seen this before or not would be a cool thing to vary in these experiments. Other things on food?
No, Mike, just a quick note. So the seminar is supposed to last an hour, which means you have about 2.5 minutes left.
Perfect.
So you should prioritize the ththings that seem most exciting for you to talk about.
I'll show you one last thing. This is totally fascinating. Don't worry about it. So this is the research with Mickey. This isn't exactly what we did, but we were looking with Nick Hobson as well. I'm not saying Francesca on all of these because I tried to say at the beginning, she's on all of them and she's amazing. The idea was you can do these rituals and they do good stuff for you, but what if there's a group that's doing the other one? So we're doing like this ritual and then we see the other group doing the other ritual. So in some experiments led by Nick primarily, we actually train people on rituals at home. And then they come into the lab and we tell them, they do like, you know, dictator game type of tasks with people. And we do a minimal groups thing like red versus blue. And so that kind of matters. But then we also do the shared ritual or not. And that kind of matters as well. So and the reason I'm making sure to say this is it's not like rituals are magically wonderful, great things that just solve all the problems and there's no downside. Of course, like all things that are ubiquitous, they're good and bad. I didn't have time to talk about in the self-control domain, obsessive-compulsive disorder, which I'm no expert in, but you could see that oversimplifying as a case where rituals have overtaken you, and instead of solving a problem, they're actually creating a problem and becoming an end to themselves. So I just wanted to end by making sure it doesn't sound like go do 100 rituals a day and everything will be magical something. That's not how they work, of course. And by the way, like with grief, doing a ritual does not solve grief. It just might be one thing you can do to help with the larger problem as well. So now I'm ending on a down note, but I will stop there. Any final amazing, brilliant question? Is the pressure too high now?
The pressure is way too high. I will tell people in the audience though that all of the questions that you've submitted will get to Mike and his co-authors even if we didn't address them here. So they will be heard. They might even get back to you, though who knows. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that assuming that Mike gives his approval, the recording that we've been making of this will eventually get posted to YouTube, so you can go back and view it again or share it with your friends and all of that sort of thing. Beyond that, thanks everybody for coming. Really great discussion. Very, very exciting, interesting panelists, and hope everybody can join us again next week. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, panelists. Thanks, Leif, Joe, and Yuri.
Thanks, everyone.